This podcast is recorded on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people.
British Columbia, I've seen your mountains high, seen your pretty rainbows and your blue crystal skies, watched your winding rivers as they flow around the bend. To me you're not a stranger, you'll always be a friend.
Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicos. Today is June 6, 2019. This is episode 141. Politicos is the BC Politics Podcast. Tell us what you think of the show by leaving us a review or get at us on social media. Most importantly, help us build the show by throwing us a couple bucks a month at patreon.com/politicos.
Scott Delonabom.
And I'm Ian Bushfield. On today's show, we're going to talk about the final report from the National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, and the federal NDP also dropped a climate plan Friday after we recorded because they're assholes. Politicos is in partnership with BC Today, British Columbia's daily newsletter dedicated exclusively to BC politics. Sign up for a free trial to have unique coverage of the BC legislature delivered to your inbox every morning. Listeners to Politicos to enter the offer code CITIZEN for access to a special rate. For your free 2-week trial of the newsletter, go to britishcolumbiatoday.ca.
And help us grow the podcast by liking our page on Facebook. Liking us helps us grow our audience and lets more people see the content that we produce. Right now, we only have about 1 in 5 of our listeners actually liking us there, so it'd be great if everyone could, and that'll way the algorithm will kick in, and hopefully a lot more people would see our podcast.
Facebook.com/Politicos, and share this episode's post on Facebook with your friends and tell them to like our page and subscribe. First up, let's talk about this final report of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls National Inquiry. It was teased on Friday. I guess CBC got a hold of an advance copy. A number of media outlets would have gotten embargoed copies, and CBC was either given the go-ahead or just went ahead, which would seem weird, to leak some of the results or the findings. Mostly that the inquiry determined there's a Canadian genocide happening against Indigenous women and girls, and there were 231 recommendations spanning the gamut. On Monday, the full report was released to the public. There was a ceremony in Quebec. Trudeau was there. Powerful moments for everyone involved, as far as I could tell. But by that point, everyone was already arguing about whether genocide was an appropriate term, and it's exhausting.
Yeah, it's been a complicated discussion, to say the least. But that's definitely grabbed, I think, everyone's attention and in some ways drowned out all the other content in the report. And there's a lot of content. It's over 1,200 pages.
I think that's including all the appendices, but yeah. I went through the executive summary, and even that was like
just
200.
The executive summary and the 2 main report documents have that. It's closer to 2,000 all in. So there's a lot of content in there, but it hasn't actually been discussed much because there's been this kind of big debate raging. And like I said, it's a complicated one. And
the biggest thing for me is because of that, the fact that this was leaked, but it may have happened. It was going to happen anyway, actually. The inquiry makes a strong case for why it uses that term. In fact, they released a supplementary report that's 50 pages alone, just talking about what genocide means legally, how the evidence they collected justifies their use of that term, and they make the argument. But before people could even have a chance to read that, it was already announced that, they're calling it a genocide, and everyone had their hot take about how many people have to die before it's officially a genocide, which is not how it works, actually.
But I mean, in case people get the wrong impressions from what was just said there, like this isn't just, Jonathan K. frantically typing something out for Quillette.
Although his was the worst.
I did not read it. But like prominent people such as Romeo Dallaire and human rights lawyer Erin Coulter both publicly took issue with it. And like those are people with solid credentials to discuss the topic. So, it's one of those things I think reasonable people can disagree on. And I also think this is one of those cases where the tense has factored in quite a bit. So the general IDSEPTA definition that's in the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide defines it as means any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group such as A, killing members of the group, B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, C, deliberately inflicting upon the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures to prevent birth within the group, and forcibly transferring the children of that group to another group. And there is unquestionably within Canadian history moments that this definition absolutely applies to. That should be relatively uncontroversial, although I think where more people are taking issue with it is describing whether or not that's currently happening.
In the last year or two, there have still been stories coming out of, I think it's Saskatchewan, where some hospitals have reportedly been sterilizing Indigenous women against their consent. They come in for a general health checkup or something related to their reproductive system, and doctor knows best that apparently she shouldn't be reproducing. But then we also still have more Indigenous kids going into foster care than were in the residential school system entirely. It feels, as a white person, less like intentionally systematized now than the residential 60s school.
I think that's part of why people are disagreeing on it.
I mean, for me personally, my hope for this process is that we can all actually at least take the time to understand why the inquiry came to that conclusion. Whether you agree with the conclusion, I'm almost less concerned about, but at least trying to read it. And the knee-jerk reactions I've seen. John Kay is the primo example because he started tweeting as soon as he saw the headlines. He knew what he wanted to put his answer out. And until you've actually read it, until you know what their arguments are, we can't pretend we're having an informed and rational debate. But I don't want to have the endless debate about genocide because that feels sad, depressing. I do want to talk about what the inquiry more broadly started to get into its recommendations. This is very long because it's 231 recommendations targeting everything from government, obviously, to social institutions, including the media, which is us, to all Canadians. There were specific recommendations for Inuit and specific recommendations for Métis peoples, or to respond to their concerns, and to what the report describes as 2S LGBTQIA peoples. I've memorized that one. That's two-spirit, lesbian, gay, trans, bisexual, queer, questioning, intersex, and asexual. And you can look
the mouthful, but
you can look all of those up on Community. They have a great dictionary of the Pride, terminology. So I'll link that in the show notes. So the recommendations, largely going through them, a lot of them are somewhat symbolic things. Every Canadian should acknowledge that violence has been happening against Indigenous women and girls. I think that should be uncontroversial for most people to take on. A lot of the government ones are more systemic. This report, we'll remember, is motivated by this question. Why are Indigenous women and girls going missing or being murdered at a disproportionate rate? Why are those murders being unsolved? Why is the Highway of Tears a thing in BC? And so it's that very tangible kind of, why aren't crimes being solved? But all the answers it comes forward with are very systemic. They're very high level. It's, governments aren't funding enough social programs on Indigenous lands. They're not recognizing the rights and titles. So it's a systemic discrimination that's keeping them down and putting a higher level of violence in these communities. And so the recommendations span the gamut from what I just talked about in terms of the symbolic ones to changes to the justice system, greater representation in media, more funding. There's even a basic income in here is recommended.
Which seems like it's beyond the terms of reference and the scope of the inquiry a bit. And also, consequently, it makes it harder for the government to actually accept the report in full. And kind of like the issue we talked about at the top of this, if anything, that might present challenges because the report calls for it to be accepted in full and all the recommendations to do it, but by packaging it as kind of a complete thing with basically overhaul the entire Canadian economy in there makes it unlikely that all the recommendations will in fact be actioned.
You're not wrong. I still want to hold to the ambition that we can aim for these kind of things.
They also in here call for every Canadian to read the report, and that's
I'm not against
ambitious for getting any fraction of Canadians to read any government report, let alone a 2,000-page one.
And considering how few Canadians have probably even opened the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report, and that one's been out for 4 years now. We have a lot to learn, though, as Canadians, and I think these reports are good starts. You talked about earlier how the report suggests reimagining the Canadian economy, but I think it's better stated that it wants Canada reimagined, because if Canada's complicit in genocide, if you accept that, or even if you don't use that word, if you say Canada has been unnecessarily violent, intentionally and unintentionally towards Indigenous people, tweaks around the edges aren't going to fix the problem, or else it would have been fixed by now. I think it was in February of last year, Trudeau talked about wanting a new relationship with Indigenous people and how he was going to start building this new set of bills to come forward to redefine a framework. That hasn't come forward, and the clock is really running out on the parliamentary session.
Yeah, there's been a couple bills. There's a Indigenous language bill. But yeah, overall, it's been fairly small tweaks. And getting back to the timing issue that you brought up with this, this report has come out in not a great time, because we're basically at the tail end of Parliament. The election officially starts in September, but realistically is going to start in a couple of weeks from now, when the House rises for probably the last time. And there just isn't time, even if the government was going to put all of these into action, and it's not necessarily the case it's going to. We've had a lot of reports throughout the years, and generally they don't get fully realized in terms of their recommendations. So even if they were going to do that, there's basically no time now, and there's some very fraught issues in here that don't make for good national discussions in the heat of an election.
I don't think the timing was the inquiry's fault.
I'm not saying it.
Yeah,
I'm just saying,
I know you
generally.
weren't. I won't. I'm just trying to make sure that's clear. I think the timing was set by the government, and so maybe they had some flexibility on the day they released, but it was going to be this month kind of thing, or this period. So it's tough. You're totally right. What do they do with this now? We'll get to the provinces in a second, because I think that's interesting. But the last section of recommendations I want to get to was an interesting one, and it comes from some of the things the inquiry heard from Indigenous women and girls, particularly in areas where there are work camps, whether it's for an oil project, logging project, or some kind of big industry comes to town. Typically, a lot of men come to work, predominantly male fields still. And because of all the stereotypical things that happen in a work camp, there's increased drinking, increased substance use, generally increased violence because there's not enough other things to do, and an excess of money. And that ends up leading to additional violence against these Indigenous women and girls. And so there's a package of recommendations and to try to both recognize this and try to find ways to decrease these incidents of sexual and other violence. And this is something I know Manitoba's starting to look at, British Columbia is starting to look at, and hopefully the federal government will bring up. Of course, already this is being talked about with respect to Trans Mountain and probably Site C, but those are the flashpoints here in BC that everyone will talk about. But how do we make these kind of industry camps less violent, and how do we make it more cohesive for the broader community if we are developing those areas? I think it's a really interesting and important question. This is a history of settler Canada, is work camps coming in and exploiting the natural resources. You'd think we could have figured this out by now. The history of BC as a province is people coming in, exploiting resources, and we just kind of go, oh, that's just how things are done. Those guys get a bit drunk. Anyway, John Horgan welcomed the report getting on to the provincial side. He recognizes the violence. BC hasn't promised to do anything specific. Horgan did talk about how he's working to implement the recommendations also of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I should point out, one of the calls to justice is just do all of the other things, inquiries, and the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples that happened, I think, 20, 30 years ago.
Like I said, there's been a lot of those reports. And
yeah, they just want them implemented.
Yeah, it's almost kind of at the point where more reports aren't going to help that much, because we kind of already know all the recommendations, or there's very specific ones to the scope here, but in general.
That was one of the criticisms against this inquiry in the first place, was we've had lots of inquiries, we just need to actually do it. But I think this does bring up a number of specific gendered aspects that are valuable. Horgan is reportedly still working on the how do we bring UNDRIP into BC law bill, and supposedly we'll see that in the fall. So that will be interesting, because I don't think anywhere in Canada has really grappled with that and taken those steps. The federal government has sort of looked at it in a couple spots, and there is a bill from Robio Saganash that basically, if this bill gets passed, the government will have committed to bringing UNDRIP into Canadian law, and there'll be regular reporting, but it doesn't actually do it.
Also, you can't make a parliament commit to do something because parliaments can't bind future parliaments.
No, you just repeal the bill. But it sets up, I think, a commission to start studying how far they're getting along the way. And it's symbolic. Nevertheless, that bill is being held up by Conservative senators who've filibustered it into the place where the committee that needs to study it probably won't be able to study it, and so they may not actually get a final vote on that bill because it's not officially a government bill, even though it's gotten the Liberal support now. It's not prioritized the same way that the government legislation is. So that may die, which does not look good in the same week this report comes out. The Senate's a mess right now for so many reasons. So, like we started off, we've only scratched the surface on this report. I think taking the time to at least try to go through the executive summary is valuable. It'll give some background on what it goes into in all of these different sections. The sections are divided up, I recall, as the right to culture, the right to security, and the right to a few other things. And so they talk about the findings in those lights, which I found really interesting because for me personally, I look very much at the human rights issues, and it talks about, and that's in the security stuff, but the discussions about culture don't seem necessarily immediately apparent why it's being discussed when we're talking about, missing women on a highway. Well, it's that systemic issue. And so it really does end up being that broad scope that is hard to get into because it's so big, but it's worth the time to at least try. And hopefully we can get some guests over the summer to further explore this and the broader important issues of how do we stop being a shitty country and start working nation to nation with all the different nations that are here.
And if you do have any guest recommendations on this or any other topic, drop us a line, podcast@politicos.ca, or alternatively, message us on Facebook or Twitter. Or if you're a patron, in our Patreon Slack. Moving on to segment 2, the NDP's climate plan. They are now the second party to have put out a plan for how to deal with climate change. Last Friday, pretty much right after we recorded, I think before we'd had our episode out, they put out their plan. It's a little more ambitious, or at least thorough, than the Greens plan, which we talked about quite thoroughly in episode 139 2 weeks ago.
We also talked about in that episode what each of us, including Stuart Prest, who was a guest on that show, wanted to see in a plan. And I don't remember exactly what we each said, so go back and listen to that to compare and contrast to what we talk about in this one. This plan is a 22-page document to the Greens 6. It's not the size, though. It's what you do with it. There are several pages that are just pictures in this plan. My favorite is
Jade beat in a canoe because apparently politicians have to paddle around now for some... just stop doing it. All those pictures look cheesy.
I got a 10%er from Jagmeet Singh because I live in his constituency. This is the mail-out that MPs are able to... You spend a bit of money to do constituent communications, and I think he used that picture in his flyer, and I believe it's on Deer Lake where he's actually canoeing around, so it is in the constituency. But I'm getting hugely off track now. The NDP's document is 6,500 words, though, to the Greens 1,600, so it is more substantial, and one of our big criticisms of the Greens was, this is it, and
it's
this
substantial.
is more.
Yeah, it talks a lot more. It still, I think, has several of the blind spots the Greens plan does. Like the Greens plan, it puts a fair bit of emphasis on, when it comes to transportation, on electrification of personal vehicles, and also in areas the Greens didn't touch on really, talks a fair bit about transit, which is good. Yeah. But it also kind of largely misses issues around commercial goods transportation, which represents a large share of transportation emissions and is also just harder to electrify or get people to mode shift away from.
And I think you talked about concrete last week as well. That's not really discussed directly in here.
Yeah, that was the other thing I was just going to bring up, was the hard industrial issues don't really get much attention here. So in that respect, it's kind of a lot of the same, surface level stuff. It's the things people think about when they think about, how do we address climate change? Renewable energies, electrification, and all of that's good, but there's some tough to solve industrial processes that don't get significantly addressed. They do talk a bit about boosting clean tech research, but it's not really detailed enough to get a sense of like how much of that's just going to be like on cleaning up industrial processes.
Yeah, I think it kind of highlights how big of a problem climate change is when, this is better. This is substantially better than the Greens plan, I will say personally. I like that there's a big focus on jobs in here. If we can get into those numbers in a bit more in a bit, there's also, like you said, it's not just on transit, talk about free transit as an ambition and as a goal. That was kind of unclear, but it's something to work towards, and just at least talking about the need for inner city and intercity transportation. There's a lot about electricity, and it gets into a lot of other elements of pollution which are bad but not necessarily climate related, but still good to deal with. The thing that I found most unbelievable, credulous, was the price tag is only $15 billion over 4 years. And I think that number got put out for the Toronto Star in advance of the plan coming out, and people immediately picked up on that and went, wait, you're going to do all of this and it'll only cost $15 billion? And I'm really skeptical. Like, they're only putting $6.5 billion in for transit. That's good, but over 4 years, and for how many major cities we have, and if you want to help make it free, you're going to need more money.
The Broadway line to UBCs, like that's going to be the price of just that. Now, typically the federal government chips in about 40%. So, if you kind of take a somewhat conservative number, like, it's basically enough to build 160 kilometers of like rail transit across the country, which that sounds like a lot, but when you actually look at like each, like that's basically enough for I think 25 kilometers in like each city over 1 million people, which is decent, but like that's not going to be the okay, everybody's now getting out of their cars level of transit investment. And there's a lot of stuff like that just and they want to retrofit all existing housing in Canada by 2050, which that alone is going to be over $15 billion. But it's spread out a long time. And that's the thing, is like they've almost all of their targets are beyond the funding they've committed in this.
I guess that's how you make it easier.
But like it's still not really enough. Like, and that's in addition to kind of just not being enough. I think the other issue here, and this is just an issue with political climate plans in general, is they just pack in a lot of stuff that isn't climate. The job stuff, for example. And that gets to be a bit of a challenge because like this is just such a big problem. You kind of need a all hands on deck, marshal all the resources we can to do the major, basically economy-wide changes you need. And the more scope creep happens in, your climate policy and it more becomes other stuff, the less effective that just becomes.
I disagree. I don't think you can pull the jobs out of it at this point, because otherwise you end up with the climate plan that can just be ignored or put on a shelf and go, well, we tried. But when it becomes ambitious and when you start talking about radically redesigning cities, the economy writ large and so forth, people immediately start going, but my job, or the job of my friend who works in Fort Mac. And so finding a way within the climate plan itself to address those fears and start talking about retraining and things like that.
Yeah, like I said,
otherwise
it's a political climate, which is different than like if you were like just serious like about solving climate change as a thing, and there wasn't those political concerns.
If only people weren't a problem.
Yeah, like the ideal technocratic climate plan would not have a bunch of stuff tacked onto it that wasn't climate related. Well, but we have to deal with politics.
You need to give people something to do or they're going to get rioty, we've learned in history. So finding what the NDP is pegging here is essentially 300,000 green jobs through all of these different programs, from retrofitting houses to building new electric vehicles. Like they talk about in here, subsidies for electric vehicles of $5,000 per car, but they'll potentially...
That's kind of what this existing subsidy.
So they'll keep it going, because I think the Liberals one eventually ends. I might be wrong about that. But they'll also have an up to $15,000 subsidy for people who are low income and buying a Canadian-made electric vehicle, which is a way to keep things like the GM plant open, which is a way to make sure you keep your voters in Oshawa happy. The thing that the NDP also got some criticism in here, and it is vague, is they don't actually give targets for what our climate goals should be. So the Greens set very clear We want to get our greenhouse gas emissions. I think they set a target twice as ambitious as we currently have. The NDP instead says they want to set science-based climate targets for 2030 based on what we need to do to keep global temperatures from increasing beyond 1.5%. I like science-based targets. It doesn't feel like those should have been hard to write down, though.
I'm pretty sure you flip open the IPCC report and get the number you need out of that.
Yeah. Deeper down in the report, there's an extra little bit. I think it's right near the end, where they say this first set of measures, which is the previous 21 pages, will reduce emissions to 450 megatons in Canada by 2030. Apparently 450 megatons is 3/4 of the way we need to get to where we need to be, though, which means their plan is only 75% finished. Their solution, though, is to mobilize Canadians to figure out the rest, to close the gap by 2030. Canadians, industry, other levels of government, and all of this. But kind of like when we talked about the Clean BC plan in here, where there was that question mark at the end. Here we have another question mark. And I appreciate the honesty of that we go, all right, it's really hard. Here's a whole bunch of things we'll try. And that gets us 75% of the way. Maybe they should pick up your heavy industry ideas and close that gap. Not that you have the solution.
I have, yeah. These are really hard problems that I do not have the solution to. But yeah, it would be good to just put a lot of resources into figuring out how to do that. So on the topic of transit, one thing in here that wasn't in the Greens plan is they want to make transit free, which doesn't seem like a great use of resources. So with the limited amount of money that's committed, there's like a fundamental trade-off in what do you do with it? And there's real opportunity costs here because, if you're making transit free, like in Vancouver, that would be $500 million every year would have to be put to offset the fare revenue from Translink, and that's chips away at that $6 billion pretty quick. Especially when they also want to electrify all transit, and just off the top, electric buses over $1 million, and there's, I would presume, well over 1,000 buses in Canada. So that gets into the billions pretty quick just to do that, and that's just keeping level with where we are and not building out any new transit with it, which gets quite challenging to actually make this all work when you're basically just then throwing money to make transit free when the major obstacle for most people taking transit isn't the cost. It's already cheaper than driving. Usually it's the service quality and how quickly it gets to places and how well they're served.
I want to hear more about the free transit plan because it's alluded to almost as a tease several times here. It talks about expanding transit, make it more affordable, even free ! And it's almost like question mark after it. And it talks later about wanting to make transit free in conjunction with municipalities and provinces that are interested or exploring that. So my suspicion is the $6.5 billion allocated to transit doesn't include making it free. I think that's if it comes up, we'll find extra money, maybe.
Which
is
once
weird
again,
math, but again,
there's still opportunity costs to that extra money.
I just want to highlight that maybe there's more money than in this pot. I just want to believe because $15 billion doesn't feel like enough because this is also including a big chunk of their economic plan. And I should say, I think their way of affording this plan in part is canceling fossil fuel subsidies, which seems like a pretty good start to shifting us off carbon is just stop subsidizing carbon. Free transit, I'm still sympathetic to. I mean, just as a socialist, and because what a transit fare is a user fee, right? It's a service user fee. We don't have that in the medical system, and it makes it smoother, arguably. Now, it might operate better on paper with a fee every time you go to the doctor, even if it's a flat fee.
Yeah, a lot of European countries do that, and it works fairly well there.
For most people, there's good arguments that user fees do discriminate against the poorest, against those most hard off, and any attempt to income test on that or do that kind of test, inevitably people fall through the cracks. And so it's a trade-off. It's a values proposition. I lean more towards where we can. Let's make things universal and free and accessible if we can. I want to see more about this conversation. I think that will be interesting. And I like that they're going there because it's a big, bold idea and it differentiates them.
It does differentiate them, but
And the NDP wasn't going to win your vote.
yeah, probably. But like places that have tried it have generally, from what I gather, seen cases where it actually hasn't increased transit usage much in terms of replacing other modes of transit. It's people will hop on the for short distances rather than walk, and it's not a major way to get people to not commute by car.
One of the other things that I like in here that they do a bit more than the Greens did. I think about how the Greens almost tacked on at the end a bit about the importance of reconciliation in these approaches. The NDP front loads that. That's the first part of this plan, is talking about working with Indigenous peoples, reconciliations straight up front, implementing UNDRIP and recognizing those rights. Finding ways to support and work with Indigenous partners on this will be important, especially in light of our whole first half of the show. The plan keeps in place the Liberals' carbon price and says they'll keep the carbon pricing sort of as the Liberals imagine it. They don't say Liberals, but that seems fine. I mean, they could have been more ambitious on it, but
it's good they're in favor of a carbon price. Like the NDP haven't always been.
Sometimes they've been more cap and trade. Sometimes it's been...
Well, provincially they've run on the carbon tats before, so like it's good they're embracing market solutions here. I mean, it would be nice if they'd also commit to increasing it past when it hits $50 and scheduled to plateau.
So one of the things they do commit to is, quote, making it fairer and rolling back the brakes that the Liberals have given to big polluters. And I heard it explained on one podcast, but I've already forgotten the exact details. But essentially, the way the Liberals' complicated carbon pricing scheme worked out is there are intensity reduction targets for heavy polluting industries. And so the NDP are going to give less of a discount than the Liberals have put.
Yeah, so I've seen a bunch of Canadian economist Twitter seem to not mind this at all, which makes me curious about it because it seems like one of those things that kind of goes against the main point of a carbon price, that it just applies a flat rate and lets everyone kind of adjust with that information and it imparts all the carbon basically usage information into the final price of everything and lets people adjust accordingly. So it does seem to go against it, but I'd be curious to get a national economist on to talk about it because I've seen several defend it, which makes me very curious on it. But yeah, overall I think it's probably good to eliminate them, and cement production, like we talked about, just produces a lot of carbon, and it doesn't really matter that other cement facilities produce more carbon than a given one. We should be aiming to bring down the industry's carbon overall and not just their relative intensities.
The last bit I want to touch on, or what I packaged together as the other pollutions set of priorities. This is the ban on single-use plastics by 2022, and this one I have mixed feelings on. I'm generally in favor of, but there are limited cases where single-use plastics are actually really valuable. The straw ban, for example, brings this really to light when people with disabilities talk about how plastic straws are actually one of the best accessibility tools for people who have difficulty drinking and wanting to get a clean, simple way to do that. And so I think making sure that the phase out of single-use plastics as the default needs to be done in a thoughtful way and not just we've now eliminated a whole bunch of products, including ones that maybe have proved necessary for some people to live a functional life. There's also an environmental bill of rights in here. This would provide everyone a guarantee of clean water, land, and air. I don't know what that would look like in practice, but it sounds good. Who could be against it?
Seems to be hard to operationalize.
There's also more specifics in that they want to return the Navigable Waters Act, essentially, that Harper repealed, and guarantee a protection of 30% of the land, freshwater, and oceans that Canada has by 2030. There's an interesting idea just mentioned in there about a system of urban national parks. I don't know what that means, but it sounds cool.
It's an idea that's floated around for a while, but yeah, what that actually means in practice.
Does it just mean Stanley Park's now a national park and gets extra money? Probably.
It's hard to say.
And then there's things like connecting farmers with local food hubs, which, fine, that's a very green idea. Green Party, I would have expected.
I think they did have that. It might be one of the points in their plan, but yeah,
But I think more better is a national food waste strategy, like trying to figure out how we can encourage particularly restaurants
Yeah, just like
to stop and grocery stores to
I think
waste less food.
ballpark, it's around 15% of the energy in agriculture goes to transportation, whereas food waste can get upwards of like 50% or more. And just how well suited a given crop is to an area can vastly overwhelm the 15% too. So like it's not even clear that you have to feed everybody. Doing it locally is even the most efficient way of doing it.
And that brings up another thing. Like this plan also mentions working with farmers and agriculture to try to reduce emissions there. It doesn't give any specifics, which is unfortunate because that's a big area.
Less beef. Like that's the big less
Well,
beef
it can
and
be less
electrifying
tractors.
Tractors, yeah, are the two big things.
And probably using less water in some places. That not that that's a direct connection to greenhouse gases, but generally making things more efficient.
But yeah, agriculture is a significant contributor to greenhouse gases. It's into the double digits as a percent of global emission.
So overall, this comes a lot closer to what I was hoping to see. It also proves how difficult it can be to put together a satisfactory climate plan for nerds like us.
Yeah, there's definitely a tendency to like throw everything in here. Like there's a national cycling strategy, which is
I think that's really good.
I know we had a back and forth on the Slack about this, but like cycling is one of those things that's very much like a local and provincial. Like there's very little
Interprovincial biking.
yeah, not only is there very little interprovincial bicycling, but there's not really any like the core competencies of the federal government that can be leveraged here beyond just the throw money at it thing, which fine, but like throw money at something isn't really a strategy.
It connects.
It's cycling is one of those things where like the expertise and stuff happens just at a lower level of government. So making there's no need to bring in like national cycling standards because transportation largely and like roads design and stuff falls under provincial governments, and so there's very little point beyond just maybe we should fund some cycling more of having it be a federal government priority.
For me, it just ties into that what we wanted to see in terms of cities. And if we want to see cities as a part of the climate solution, we'll start from there. If we want to see cities that are denser, more active transport, and so on and so forth, that means more cycling. Obviously, we both agree on that. Now, how do we get there? There is a role for, obviously, cities, provinces, because provinces own cities. What I see the federal government having a place for here is making sure good ideas are being implemented in Vancouver, get transported to Calgary, Edmonton, and everyone else gets to connect them. That's not to say duplicate expertise, but just help facilitate the sharing of expertise. There's no reason for the federal government to be in 2/3 of the things it's in, but just making sure that we can get those good standards across the country and help lift things up. When it's done right, I think it'd be done well. If it's just like another agency.
It'd have to be an opt-in standard unless they're going to play very hardball with the infrastructure money.
Even just the federal government chipping money in to build bike lanes would help encourage it across the country, and it would be cheap relative to SkyTrains and LRTs, which we should also be building. Yeah, so overall, I'm okay. I could still hope for more. I think David Moscrop said it as he's very disappointed because this is probably the best we've seen, but still probably a 60-40 chance that life as we know it has to end. He's gotten really dark.
Yeah, it's not ambitious enough. It's really the long and short of it is. But it's probably going to be one of the more ambitious ones we see. And so I suppose it comes down to the question of, are we grading on a curve or not? Because at best, this is like a very low passing, like scraping by on a path. So we're not grading on a curve.
Well, I guess if you're voting, you're grading on a curve and balancing all kinds of other things. I don't know, maybe our podcasts will inspire the parties to do more. One of the other things coming up that will hopefully make grading all of these different parties easier is there's a group of students out of University of Guelph who've actually gotten together and started a nonprofit called Shake Up the Establishment, and they're launching a website that will have a grid comparing the parties' platforms as they come out on the environment and starting to not necessarily rank them, but at least help you understand what everyone's promising. And I'll throw the link for that in the show notes. I think it's promising. I don't know. I only took a quick look at it, but I want to see more of this. And I think this trend, I hope it's a trend with the Greens and now NDP releasing relatively detailed policy documents early in the run-up to the election. I mean, Trudeau did this in 2015, and it helped him get elected. I much prefer that kind of approach to politics than the usual everyone just yells and screams at each other, and we don't actually get to talk about issues, which is what will happen once the writ drops. Moving on to quick takes, the newest ship to leave the dock for BC Ferries has gotten quite a bit of press for its checkered history and massive over budget. Rob Shaw's got a great piece in the Vancouver Sun documenting the history of the Northern Seawolf, which is also a great name for a boat. This is the ferry that's going from Bella Coola to the north end of Vancouver Island. And the whole thing is like a picture story for you, Scott. It's all about government procurement, partisan interference in the bidding processes, and just inability to renovate a ship. And it's got some marine elements in it.
So this all starts back in 2013 when the Port Hardy Bella Coola route was cancelled by the government. The justification for this was that basically a $7 million a year money sink, and it worked out to a $2,500 per vehicle subsidy. So, can the route. Turns out it wasn't all that popular with the people using the route, and Bella Coola is not that easy to get to from
Anywhere?
Yeah, but yeah, the drive in is not great. So they sold the ferry that was on the route, the Queen of Chilliwack, after it had undergone a big expensive refit, which not great. But anyway, interestingly enough, they sold it to a former BC Ferries employee who is living in Fiji and running a private ferry line, which it's in some ways just the most random, interesting part of the story. Fiji has a private ferry line run by former BC Ferries people.
With a former BC ferry.
Yes. Anyway, so he bought the ship, brought it down to Fiji, but then in 2017, bowing to political pressure, basically, the past government wanted to get the ferry line back up and running, so they hastily acquired this old Greek ferry.
Yeah, it sounds like the government put pressure on BC Ferries to essentially open the route as fast as possible. And that meant they couldn't build a ferry here in BC, which would have been expensive, but would have created jobs, been politically fine, and they'd gotten away with it.
Or they could have done what they did with the other and bought them from Europe, which also worked fine.
Well, they bought this one from Europe.
Yes, but they could have also done what they did and got a new ship built in Europe.
But because they had a rush process, there was only, I think I heard, a handful of ferries around the world that were for sale at that time that fit the bill because it needed to be not too big, but also handle, Northern Ocean waters around the fjords and stuff. Yeah, it had to have an
enclosed car deck and everything.
And so they find this one from Greece. It looks like it'll fit the bill. They have an inspector go, and he's like, yeah, it looks fine. They put it on a barge or sail it across the world, comes through the Panama Canal, comes up the west coast, gets here, and it turns out it's a bit of a lemon with a whole bunch of repairs that were needed.
Yeah, so there were no working sprinklers on board. The propeller shaft was, quote, worn beyond allowable specifications. There was significant metal corrosion. The HVAC system didn't work. The elevator wasn't up to code. There were problems with the stern door, the thing that keeps those ocean waves from coming in and sinking the ship. Just a lot of problems with it. So for what was originally supposed to be a $55 million project ended up ballooning to $76 million.
Okay, 50% more.
Which, I think that's better than when we bought Victoria-class submarines from the Brits, which, we just gotta stop buying used European or just anyone's old boats or ships.
But despite all that, the ferry finally managed to take its maiden voyage, or at least its British Columbia maiden voyage, on Monday. And you'll notice it is 2019, and we bought this boat in 2017 to replace a route that was slated to be closed in 2013. So it's been quite the sordid tale, but at least it sounds like now the boat's up and running and people can make their, I think it's a 20-plus hour ferry ride.
Done it once before. It was, I think, it was an overnight ferry ride, I think. It's a long trip. Bella Coola is quite a bit north of Port Hardy, yeah.
But at least the ferry's back up and running. And I mean, the story of BC ferries is it's expensive to do some of these routes, and you need to gouge the people on the Vancouver-Victoria ferry to subsidize everyone else. But from our provincial nightmare to our federal nightmare, the Justice Committee has been a shit show this week as they study online hate and radicalization. I don't know where to start with this. There's Conservative MP Michael Cooper, who berated a Muslim guest. We talked about this last week. He's been removed from the committee now. He's still Deputy Justice critic, so it's a half censure from Andrew Scheer. The committee has voted to expunge his statements from the Hansard records, which I didn't know was a thing they could do. I guess it makes sense.
Parliament's made its own rules.
Yeah.
But there's a method in here.
And I guess it makes sense. You don't really want, like, a troll mass murderer's records just arbitrarily read into your Hansard record as a committee. Like, there could be a use for that. This was not a good one. So.
At the same time, like, the record exists for a reason, and, like, it's not great to be kind of going back and retroactively changing it. Like, it's a fairly good argument that it should just represent what was said.
Yeah, I see both sides on it.
And, like, you know, what was said obviously wasn't great, but, like, the chance that someone's going to, like, flip through the Hansard and get radicalized is very, very small, and starting to establish a norm of, let's edit out stuff is not great. And, like, the balance between those two, I think, leans with just let the record stand. And
well, at least the media record of his shitty comments will stand forever.
Well, that's the other thing. It's like it's not like it hasn't.
It's a symbolic move for the committee. The other side of the committee, though, was the Conservatives' string of witnesses they invited that included... Well, they had invited Jordan Peterson, but he was busy, almost unfortunately. So instead we got Lindsay Shepherd, Mark Stein, who I believe is the former editor of the Western Standard, who's been charged for hate speech under like a Canadian Human Rights Code for republishing the anti-Muslim comics from the Danish Post.
No, that was Ezra Levant.
Wasn't Mark Stein also involved in that, though?
He had a case going on at the same time. He involved an excerpt from a book that he wrote that ended up being published in something.
Right.
Yeah, anyway, like 10 years ago now, there were some controversies around the Human Rights Code, I think, whether or not it was being overly broadly applied in those cases. Anyway, he got caught up in that with Ezra Levant.
Nevertheless, the section of the Human Rights Code they were caught under was repealed by the Harper Conservatives. So when they're at this committee talking about how they've been censored, and Lindsay Shepherd's example was she was banned from Twitter for 5 days. And I guess the implication is the government ought to do something about that. I have difficulty having sympathy for her, especially after, I think it was Randy Boissonneau, because he was on fire at this committee this time, pointed out, well, why were you on neo-Nazi podcasts?
And
she has been. She said, I'm not here to talk about me, I think. Didn't go great for them.
Yeah. What role does social media have, and like how does that, like, is it actual like a private company, public platform? Like, that's a complicated issue that I don't think is going to get resolved anytime soon,
and probably not by a committee that's going through these kind of hearings. Like, he'll come up with some recommendations, but it's so close to the election that it's not going to be decided soon. So it was just, all in all, such a weird set of hearings. I mean, Randy Boissonneau, I believe, asked Mark Stein, because they were focused on the criminal code ban on hate speech and incitement to hatred. And Boissonneau asked, can you name me one example of someone who's been charged under that who you think shouldn't have been? And the guests kind of referred back to human rights code issues, but not the actual criminal code. The fact is, very few people are actually charged ever under our hate speech laws. Whether you think they're good or not, they're kind of just over there, not doing anything. And I don't know, I guess it was just a chance for everyone to have their uproar about the culture wars as they go on. It is kind of telling that these are the people the Conservatives felt they could benefit from by inviting to this committee, because the guests of the committee are chosen by different MPs and the Conservatives chose this group. I mean, there are interesting people who could push back on, like, hate speech. Civil libertarians, like the association I'm on the board of, would have some great, brilliant things to say. There are plenty of committees, so maybe this wouldn't have been a priority. But, You know,
Yeah, like
there are
it's-
lots of law profs, for example, who've talked about, do our hate speech laws go too far? If that's what you want to talk about.
Yeah, it seems like the selection here was definitely on people with name recognition more than people who would like present like the case most effectively.
Oh yeah, they tried to get Ben Shapiro. This parliament's almost done. I want to say the next one can't be worse, but it can't.
Probably going to be good chance it's going to be a minority parliament and even more shenanigans.
But we love our shenanigans here in British Columbia.
And that has been Politicos. Find links to everything we talked about at politicos.ca. If you're a first-time listener, make sure to subscribe and let us know what you think. Support the show and get access to our exclusive Slack channel at patreon.com/politicos. If you have ideas for the show, feel free to send it to us. Our intro music credit is Beautiful British Columbia by Kirsten Plotnikoff. Thanks for listening.